Hi, and welcome to your first bedtime story. I'm Prankur Arora, and tonight's story is called Mountain Odyssey, written by Mahima Kohli. I hope these stories will be a welcome part of your nighttime routine and that you will be sleeping better now. The key to sleep is relaxation, and the key to relaxation is to bring your attention to the present moment, to let go of the past and the future. And stories help us do just that. So make sure that you're comfortable as you are lying down, and let the words of the story come and go like the waves of the ocean, rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. And once you're ready, we shall begin. Welcome to the land of the Yetis. Mythical, dangerous, mysterious. Uma smiled at the signboard as her jeep climbed up a steep road. She was on her way to Lachung, a small village in the lap of the eastern Himalayas. She was a senior copywriter with a marketing firm based in Bangalore. After 4 years of working round the clock, she had forgotten what it was like to take a day off or to spend time by herself doing nothing. She loved her job and did not mind the long hours or the lack of a personal life. But her boss was worried she was nearing burnout. So she encouraged Uma to take a break to rejuvenate and relax. After much deliberation, Uma decided to take off on a solo trip to the northeast. It would be a welcome change from the constant socializing that marked her life in the city. The following week, she was on her way to Sikkim, the gateway to the northeast of India. She had arranged to stay at a quaint little hotel on the outskirts of Gangtok, surrounded by a deep forest. On the first morning, Uma woke up early to the melody of birdsong. Thrilled, she jumped out of bed, only to be reminded that she was in the Himalayas, because the air was biting cold. She opened the cupboard and found a warm robe. Pulling it tightly around her weary body, she stepped out on the balcony to a mesmerizing view. A vast pine forest stretched out in front of her. Wherever her eyes turned, there was a sea of green set ablaze by the first rays of the sun. Uma had never seen such pristine beauty before. She stepped back in, threw the French windows open, and drew back the curtains. The room was flooded with natural light, drawing Uma's gaze to the portable coffee press she had brought along with her. She set a kettle full of water to boil and rummaged through her bags for a box of her favorite Malabar coffee. 10 minutes later, Uma sat at the edge of her bed, bathed in sunlight, soaking in the intoxicating aroma of coffee and pine cones. After a hot shower and a hearty breakfast, Uma requested the hotel staff to arrange a jeep to drive her to Lachung. On the way, she was spellbound by the sheer unspoilt beauty of the Sikkimese countryside. She had heard that Sikkim was a Buddhist state, but nothing could have prepared her for the sense of spiritual calm that washed over her as she travelled through the heavenly landscape. Colourful prayer flags dotted the lush valley, and snowy peaks loomed tall in the distance like giant yetis. The mountainside was covered in a series of waterfalls, rhododendron bushes, and the occasional patch of hardwood forest. By the time Uma reached the sleepy village of Lachung, the sun had long set and a heavy mist had descended upon the mountains. They drove up a narrow stretch to the homestay where the kind hotel staff had arranged for her to spend the night. Her driver, Arjun, was a local. He encouraged her to keep warm and get a good night's sleep. They had an early start the next morning, and he had a feeling it was going to rain. Uma remembered the bright and sunny morning she had woken up to. Surely, Arjun's fears were ill-founded. She went up to her room and fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow. At 5:30 the next morning, Uma heard a knock on her door and Arjun's voice urging her to be ready in half an hour. She sat up in bed and clutched the blanket to herself. The air inside the room felt cold and wet. She could hear the sounds of raindrops on the roof. Uma wondered how the weather could have changed so suddenly. It was the end of September. The monsoon was supposed to be behind them. With a sigh, she got out of bed and looked outside the window. The sun wasn't out and the sky looked overcast. She was going to need all the warmth she could get. The homestay was owned by a middle-aged Sikkimese couple who had spent a fair share of their lives working in Mumbai. They had eventually retired to their native village and set up a homestay to host travelers. They invited Uma to share a breakfast of pancakes, vegetable dumplings, and tea as they recounted stories of their previous guests. It wasn't long before she felt her fatigue and anxieties starting to melt. The simple homemade meal soothed her soul like a hug. Uma hadn't felt such warmth and love in a very long time. Just then, Arjun appeared in the doorway, beckoning at her. She thanked her hosts, then covered herself in several layers and set out with Arjun on a drive to North Sikkim. Uma had never been this high up in the Himalayas. As the car wound its way through curving roads and sharp bends, she marveled at the rugged landscape. The sky had begun clearing up an hour into the drive, and with the gloomy weather gone, Uma's spirits were up again. The ride was bumpy. Arjun explained that very few tourists visited those parts during the rains because of the poor condition of the roads. But it was a true backpacker's delight, and Uma was thrilled that she had chosen to come. From the window of the car, they could see nothing but a never-ending blanket of white fluffy clouds. Despite the closed windows, a chilly draft seemed to be creeping in from somewhere. Uma hugged herself for warmth. Arjun saw her crouching out of the corner of one eye. Reaching into a hamper behind the driver's seat, he brought out a shiny flask and handed it to her. She unscrewed the cap and the aroma of sweet cardamom tea filled the air. Uma smiled at Arjun, her eyes dripping with gratitude. She took out her phone to play music and sank back into her seat, contented. The clouds continued to play hide and seek over the valley to the company of soulful jazz and delicious hot tea. As they ascended the steep mountainside, the landscape began to transform. The rugged brown terrain gave way to lush green fields, with barely a human in sight. The solitude was broken only by the occasional Buddhist stupa, surrounded by endless strings of brightly colored prayer flags. Arjun told Uma that they were approaching a height of 15,000 feet with a view of Yumthang Valley down below. To put it in perspective, he grinned, if this were Mount Everest, we would be a little more than halfway up the peak. She was fascinated. The valley from that height looked like one of the impressionist paintings that hung from the walls of her grandfather's house in Pondicherry. She made him stop the car twice so she could take in the full beauty of the sight and freeze it forever on her camera. It was noon by the time they reached 0 Point, where they got out of the car and continued on foot. The beauty that surrounded them was beyond anything Uma had ever witnessed. She thought about the Swiss Alps that she had seen in the glossy magazines her mother subscribed to. At a young age, she had told her mother that she would one day visit Europe and hike through the snow-clad Alps. The panorama that unfolded before her in that moment made her forget all about her European dreams. Sikkim had her enchanted. The sky above their heads was an infinite blanket of the softest blue. White, cotton candy clouds hung low over rocky grey cliffs. A herd of cows grazed in an open meadow, looking up briefly at the two humans encroaching upon their space. Rhododendron bushes bloomed with the last flowers of the season before fall descended upon them. Little ahead, they heard the sound of ripples from a distance. Uma looked over her shoulder at Arjun, who flashed a knowing smile. Excited, she ran ahead until her eyes fell upon a stream of sparkling clear water. The stream gurgled gently over a bed of pebbles it had smoothed over the years. There was a tiny wooden plank placed tentatively across the stream. Arjun helped Uma balance on the plank and crouch so that her hands were immersed in the ice-cold water. A chill ran up her spine, and she squealed with joy. The unspoiled charm of the Sikkimese countryside was a healing balm for her tired city-bred heart. As Arjun went about picking up freshly fallen rhododendron blooms, Uma lay down on a patch of dry grass by the water. After a very long time, she felt at ease, like being at home. Everything she wanted was right there, within her reach, under that bright blue sky. Nothing was amiss. Uma felt renewed, body, mind, and soul. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the sun wash over her. On their way back to the village, Arjun put on a local rendition of a song Uma remembered hearing on the radio growing up. The sky was beginning to darken, and clouds were beginning to settle upon the valley again. The car was soaked in the sweet smell of rhododendrons. They sat in silence, swaying gently to the beats.